everyone, and welcome back to the Future in Review podcast. I'm here today with Berit Anderson, who is the CEO of Invent IP, head of programs at Future in Review, and the senior analyst at the Global Report. And most importantly, he is my brother. So for those of you who are maybe are new to the podcast or haven't listened to too many of the Future in Review podcasts before, we are one part of a pair of independent family media companies focused on the future of technology and the global economy. And as such, you will see Evan, my brother, and Mark, my father, as sometime guests on this show. We each have different kind of areas of expertise and specialties. And today we are here with Evan to talk about the future of human brain interfaces. So what are the technologies that are available out there today enabling your brain to interface with computing infrastructure?
Brain-computer interfaces.
Yeah. What might be coming in the future and how those things are relevant to your life. So, Evan, your recent piece this past week in the Global Report was about cyborg technology, brain-computer interfaces. Can you give us kind of like a brief overview of what is available now? What are the different categories of BCIs out there today?
Yeah, so this was a fun one, as you might imagine. Always fun writing about technology that's this fascinating. I think it kind of captures our imagination for some obvious reasons, because there's kind of a long history in sci-fi, et cetera, covering a cyborg future. And so I think what's really cool that's going on now is that we've moved in a couple of step function type ways towards that future. There's still more progress to be made, but it is one of the fields in tech that I think is really quite exciting right at this moment. And I think people, know that a bit, but what we've really done.
There's been a lot of buzz recently about Neuralink, right? Doing their first demo of a brain-computer interface. What else is going on out there? And
yeah,
where
so
do they
what we've
fit in the ecosystem?
Yeah, what we've really seen lately is a move from some of these kind of more basic systems that have existed for a while. So Neuralink, for instance, is an implant, and there's kind of two categories, right? Is it a wearable or an implant? If you're going to use something to try to take, not always brain too, so there's different terms for it, but either direct signaling from the brain or signals from your body in some way that are like micro signals, right? To communicate with a computer. Those are sort of your categories. It's either something kind of wearable or it's implanted directly. And I think two things have happened that are really exciting right now. We went from these wearables that we kind of already had and had been developing for a long time that were more like EEG headsets that don't necessarily work super well. I was talking with one of our members on an email thread about this. An fMRI, tech that doesn't work super well for direct connection to kind of between your will. It's really about, telepathy, which we'll get into a little bit because Dave Siegel, who we interviewed for this piece, was talking a lot about that. You want, your thoughts to become action in some way. And so, very fun, of course, but we've gone from these kind of more rudimentary tools that sort of worked in certain ways, but didn't probably have the promise that we need in order to really control things with our minds. And we've done like a full step function change in all categories, really. So Dave's company, Naculogics, who we had at Future in Review, actually, it was very cool. And they have a wearable, but it's an earbud. And that's been completely different than previous wearables, and allows micro movements in your ear in a way I'm not sure I totally understand to control, cursors, et cetera. And then for Neuralink, their big deal is not that they're the first implant. There have been brain implants for quite a long time. But as we kind of focused on the piece, I wish we had the pictures here, but they were kind of clunky. And so they were advanced, Neuralink, and it was, no. The previous ones. I mean, it really looks effectively like, a washing machine plug-in, like one of those 30 amp plugs stuck into your skull. And so that probably is not the future, right? That's, it had its place because it was the first iterations of this technology. But what Neuralink has done that's cool is not connect the brain to a computer. That already had been done. It's that it's really, really svelte, right? It's very user friendly. It's very um, small and unnoticeable, and does the same thing or better than previous implants. So that's really cool. There are other implant companies that I mentioned in the piece too that I think are fascinating. I can't remember the name, but there's one that literally laced inside the blood vessels of your brain, laced all these little electrodes through the blood vessels of your brain. And so they're trying that approach. And you can feel, I think, that there's kind of this great precipice that we're on the edge of, where all of the enabling technologies that took years, standing on the shoulders of giants, all these enabling technologies didn't exist in the past. And so it was really hard to do something that was, perfect form fitting, where you wouldn't notice that the person had that implant, and that person would be comfortable moving around with that implant rather than, stuck right next to the computer, effectively plugged in. Things are now, perfectly Bluetooth capable, which is a big difference. If you're someone who has mobility issues, you don't necessarily want to be plugged into the computer interface that you're using, right? So all of these different kind of supply chain aspects of this potential industry have gotten resolved over time. And all the innovation that's gone into all of those different fields now applies in one space, which I think is always one of the more interesting things in tech.
Okay, so let's back up a minute. I feel like there's a lot of talk about cyborgs in general and like AI and brain computer interfaces. But like, what is the point, right? I don't personally, like, if someone was like, do you want me to install a Neuralink in your brain right now? I'd be like, hell no, definitely not.
Yeah.
I do not want that. What is the benefit to someone of having that? And I'm talking about specifically about the implants. Like, what categories of people might actually benefit from that?
Yeah, I mean, for the reason you're describing, early iterations are not targeted at just the average person, and I think that could be quite a ways off, right? The idea that we would just be getting for beneficial reasons potentially, but getting implants without having a specific need for them, just to enhance our activities, I think is more far future than near future. But what's really obvious as the key target market right now is people who have mobility issues, who've been paralyzed, and the solutions that we've had, which serve their purpose well to some degree, are not exactly easy for these people to use. So if you're in a wheelchair, there are these little straws that you can manipulate with your mouth to try to use a cursor on a computer, or they've done work with eye movements and things like that. But it's hard to sit there and do all that for hours on end. And I think the Neuralink, the first patient, I think they're calling him P1, who had the Neuralink, was saying that, it was like, this is just that much better than these things that were so exhausting to use. It was hard to sit there and do anything for hours on end by manipulating this little straw with your mouth, but now it's much more smooth. And so I think for people with mobility issues right now, this is about to become a potentially very cool thing that really opens up their lives. So it's inspiring in that way. But what I'm seeing kind of more 3 to 5 years out is in a perfect world, you would get in a car accident on Monday and find out, 2 days later that you may be permanently paralyzed, and then with this kind of technology receive some sort of immediate surgery and assistance with an implant, so that it didn't take very long before you were able to regain some of the freedom that you had. And so I think we're going to be getting closer and closer to that. I'm not saying that's going to happen in 3 years, but the technology that will make that possible is being developed now. And so as we see these products start to come out, the other half of the piece was about prosthetics, advances in prosthetics and exoskeletons. And that's all in the same category, right? If you're a normal person just, walking through your daily day, you're not going to be needing an exoskeleton necessarily. But I imagine for certain tasks, there are companies that are developing exoskeletons that help with, for instance, difficult manual labor where you can injure your back, so preventative. And then also for folks that are already mobility limited, this stuff could be really groundbreaking pretty soon here. And if you can connect a good implant or a good wearable that gives you a good ability to use your thoughts or micro movements that you already have the ability to make, essentially, right? To manipulate your new prosthetic, that's getting pretty close. I think I joked about it in the piece. It's not the print-on arms of Star Wars that we all know, but it's getting pretty close to the future we sort of imagined in science fiction 50 years ago. And so I have a lot of hope for that. I think if you're, injured in a conflict or lose a limb or lose mobility in some way, 5 years from now, the options available to you to do something about that are just going to be like earth-shatteringly different than what we have right now.
And let's say that I don't have the use of my arms or legs. I've been in a terrible accident and I can no longer move. Why would I choose the implant versus what Naki is doing, which is kind of like a non-invasive in-ear interface?
It seems to me, at least, that this is essentially an arms race. So you wouldn't want an implant if there was a wearable that did exactly the same thing. And there's kind of just multiple approaches being tried in both fields.
Except for the fact that I constantly lose my AirPods, and maybe that's
harder to lose an implant. Yeah. True, but I imagine, this is kind of just more about human nature, and I imagine most people would rather have a wearable than an implant. But if the implant is offering you things that you just simply can't get with a wearable, and that's not up to anyone's opinion, that's up to what the tech gets capable of over the next few years, then that would be the reason. I think you'd have a more invasive procedure if it gave you more capability.
Okay, well, let's talk about the capability. That's a good answer. Let's talk about the capability part of that. What do you think is like these brain computer interfaces are going to be capable of in the future that they can't do right now?
Yeah, that's almost anyone's guess if we're talking about far out, which I think is one of the fascinating parts. I mean, when we were interviewing Dave at Naki, what he was saying was that even with their earbud, they're now able to essentially give you a non-visual, imaginary OS, essentially. And you can manipulate that OS and just with audio, open files or whatever. So the possibilities are pretty endless there. The ability to essentially have like a Google Glass-like experience with doing things like surfing the web, particularly, again, if you're mobility compromised and you can't, easily just use a keyboard or something. If you can just sit there and use the internet inside of your own head, essentially, that's pretty amazing. And there's a lot of different things that you can do with it. One thing that I think will be iffy and depend on regulation and kind of the public response to it would be navigating using any mode of transportation, you may be able to navigate without using your hands. And so I think that'll, again, depend on, what the level of safety is and how regulators respond to it. But that's pretty groundbreaking. So imagine you can fly a drone just by not moving at all, but sitting there and picturing where you want it to go, or something along those lines, or drive a car or fly a plane. There's a lot of possibilities there. And again, I think now you could do these things to some degree with the tools we have. In 5 years, I think it will be easier by far to do these things, probably with skill. And then far out into the future, it really is kind of a perfect example of the true promise of tech, where it's really hard to imagine what we might be able to develop, but there are a lot of different potential things that you could do. I mean, I know, for instance, unsurprisingly, I think governments around the world are very interested in this. Some of this could get pretty wild and a little scary when it comes to military applications, but it could also be a really good thing, right?
Maybe. I mean, I think that we're in a reality right now. We also in our work talk a lot about the Crank Alliance, right? China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. One of the first instances that I saw of China and Russia working together early on in a military alliance was the two countries teaming up to build a robot army together.
That would be bad, right?
They have been doing that for a long time.
Yeah,
that was back in like 2015, I think, or so, or maybe earlier. And so I guess I'm curious, when you think about, clearly that's not yet in wide use that we know of.
Drones are more the order of the day in terms of what's being used in the field and combat. That's kind of the new thing, right?
What implications do you see for conflict, given the widespread adoption or adaptation of cyborg infrastructure, whether that's human? I mean, we've talked about remote piloting. That's clearly one thing. removing any kind of like physical barriers to performance when it comes to piloting a plane or a drone or some kind of land vehicle. What are the other potential downstream implications of that for warfare? Like, is it going to make
all
it less
sorts, right? And I think
likely?
make warfare more or less likely.
Yeah.
I think neither, right? I think that's a different question entirely. I guess in the way that all technology it could make warfare more likely if a nation thought that they were the only ones with the most advanced technology. But that's kind of not a new problem, right? That's in some ways how World War I started as well, was overconfidence in combat abilities when in fact they were relatively even. But I think the implications for kind of on the ground day-to-day warfighting would be myriad. You can picture a soldier, with an implant or, the ability to articulate something that's distant from them, doing all sorts of things. And the exoskeletons too, if it allows you to carry more weight. I mean, one of the biggest problems for foot soldiers is that the number of tools and things to carry never gets smaller. It gets larger
Right.
every year. And people are, pretty much at a limit at some point with how much weight they can carry. So this could certainly solve, if you're mixing brain interfaces with exoskeletons, you can change the settings. It allows you to lift more or carry more and, save your back. I imagine a lot of infantrymen would be really excited about that. But there's all sorts of other implications, of course. I mean, I know there's been a fair amount of coverage of potential drone swarms. And if you picture that you could launch a drone, right from your hand and control it with your brain while you're doing something else simultaneously, that's pretty wild stuff.
What about this technology do you find most surprising?
I would say that it works, I think, is the most surprising part, right? I think that's what's exciting, is that this is the kind of stuff we used to dream about, and we're closer than ever and accelerating very fast towards a time where you really can detect signals in the brain, compared to the old EEG helmets that, you can kind of get a sense of some kind of more basic things that were happening in your brain. It was like, is this part of your brain turned on or not? But now we're much closer to, this is how you would actually turn left or, move a cursor or write. I mean, people can write by moving things around just with the signals in their brain. That is so unprecedented in terms of our actual ability to get it done, and happening much more frequently now. And I think that's really exciting. I think that in general, it's easy to worry about these things, but this feels to me like an area of technology that also has great promise and probably will deliver a lot of really positive things in people's lives.
I'm curious, when you think about, the positive things in people's lives that it might deliver, like if we think about the brain chemistry side of things, did you come across in your research anything new that has been discovered as a result of this work about human brain chemistry? Like, what is the neurochemistry part of the equation?
Well, in terms of, that's kind of a tough question, I guess. I didn't come across anything that we had learned yet from implants about brain chemistry. I think what really has happened to date is that our understanding of the brain has drastically improved, right? And so a lot of really long-term, difficult, complex research has been done over the last 50 years, really, and of course all of human history. But really, for brains, modern history is the real era of proper brain research, and it's gotten so advanced now that we just understand the brain so much better that these things are more possible. So I would kind of put that in the basket of things that needed to happen for these implants or wearables to improve in that kind of step function way. You can't really do that if you don't understand how the brain works, and we're still, of course, have plenty to learn, but we're just miles ahead of where we would have been even 40 years ago. In terms of chemistry, a lot of these things are more electrical than chemical. So I don't think, I'm not quite sure if you're asking about like depression and things like that, if there's anything there. I actually don't know. So maybe someone watching this video does, and could tell, me that there's
So if you're an
something new in the field.
neurochemistry,
I am not an expert in neurochemistry.
Yeah. If you're watching this podcast and you're an expert in neurochemistry and
Oh,
brain
yeah.
computer interface, hit me up. I would love to have a conversation with you
Yeah,
about
reach
that
out.
because
Reach
it is
out.
a fascinating topic. Well, Evan, thank you so much for your time today. Has been a delight to speak with you as always. And I will just put one little plug out there for if you are not a member of the Strategic News Service Global Report already, if you're not a subscriber to that, you listeners of this podcast, watchers of this podcast, get 50% off their first year, and you can sign up for that in the description just below this video. So we hope that you will join us. You can read all of the details about the future of human brain-computer interfaces and all of the many, many other things that we write about every week. Thank you, Ev.
Thank you.